If you've been following binge eating recovery content for a while, you'll probably hear the same triggers spoken about over and over again. We know that dieting, mental restriction, scarcity is a big trigger for binging. We know that emotional events can be a big trigger for binging. But in this video, I want to talk about some other triggers for binging that just don't get spoken about as much, but I would think are fairly common. And my hope is that by sharing these with you, that they might just help give you a little bit more insight into what might be going on for you. So the first less frequently spoken about trigger for binging is binging itself. By which I mean, have you ever had that experience where you binge, maybe before you go to bed, and you wake up the next day feeling terrible? Like you physically feel unwell, emotionally you're feeling awful about yourself, and you're beating yourself up. I used to do this a lot. I would feel so terrible after a binge that I would want to binge again to deal with the feelings of having binged. And I could get into cycles that could go on for weeks and even into months where I was binging every day, because to stop binging would mean to confront how I physically felt, how I mentally felt, and how I emotionally felt. So Stephanie Michelle, who I co-host the Life After Diets podcast with, she has dubbed this the meta binge. And the mental process is basically, I'm binging because I binged. In order to break the cycle of the meta binge, we need to learn how to come back into some sense of balance or regulation after a binge. And I have a whole playlist on what to do after a binge, and I'll link it above and below. But for me in my recovery, I learned how to recover from a binge first before I figured out how to actually stop binging, because my reaction to the binges was part of what kept triggering even more binging. The second trigger, which isn't spoken about that much, is transitions, which is the idea of using food as a transitional object when you move from one thing to another thing. So it could be when you finish work. It could be, and again, this was a common one for me, having been out with a lot of people and then suddenly being on my own. That transition would often cause me to binge. Coming back from a holiday, I would binge. And now I do want to note there was a time when that binging was influenced by the fact that I couldn't binge when I was around other people. But when that became less of a problem for me, I still found these transitional binges were happening. Travel was a huge one for me. The amount of airports I have binged my way through. I used to get the train a lot from London to Bournemouth, a few times a month, and I would always buy food to binge on the train. And so I wouldn't sit on a table because I didn't want to risk someone coming and sitting opposite me, because I didn't want anybody watching me while I was doing this. So I would pick a little two-seater, and if someone came and sat next to me when I was on that train, I can still remember it now. It was like this rage that would swell up inside me, because now I felt like I couldn't binge, and in my brain it was like it was already happening. Now here's how I think of transitions when we're going from one thing to another, is how we experience ourselves, which is how we feel and how we are behaving, is massively affected by the situation that we're in. So how I feel and act when I'm around my family compared to when I'm in work mode, compared to when I'm ruffling up my kitty cat, they're all a bit different, which is not to say they're not me, but it's almost like a switching of modes that happens. So it's like the brain has to go from one thing to another thing. It's like it's switching neurological tracks. I'm someone, I like spending time with people. I'm quite sociable and extrovert, and I like time on my own. But the transition between the two was the thing that felt so uncomfortable. And I would say the only thing that really helped me with this to reduce the transitional eating was the insight and understanding what was going on. When I thought about it as just like, this is my brain trying to switch gears, and it just hurts a bit to switch gears. And hurt sounds like a strange word, because how it felt, that transition, how it felt, there isn't a word in the English language to describe that. But there was something about food that seemed to smooth over that transition. So it was about being able to tolerate the feelings of that transition, which became easier once I understood or had a bit of a sense of what it was, and that it would pass, it would be okay, because in the moment it was just, again, no word for the feeling, but my brain was like, I just have to eat on this. And the third one, I want to talk about weight loss, but I want to talk about the psychology of weight loss. So we know that losing weight creates biochemical changes in the body that can trigger binging. But for some people, there is a conscious or subconscious fear of losing weight. For whatever reason, the brain has marked it as unsafe. Now, that could be because previously they've taken weight loss too far and been weight suppressed. So there's a fear of it leading somewhere dangerous. And for a number of people, it's about feeling more visible and exposed if you lose weight. You might experience more sexual attention, and that can feel incredibly unsafe depending on your history and your current circumstances as well. And this one doesn't get spoken about quite as much because I think most people think, I want to lose weight. Like there's no negative, there's no downside to losing weight. It's what I want for myself. And yet, again, depending on what you've been through, this one's not going to apply to everyone. There may be a part of you that really fears it and reacts. If you feel like if that part gets wind that the body's getting smaller, either through getting some attention or stepping on the scale or whatever it is that makes that part of the brain go, hang on a second, are we losing weight here? That can trigger a binge response in some people. And because for many people this stuff isn't so much in the here and now consciousness, for some people it is, but a lot of people it's not. It's older stuff. Often therapy and doing some work around this sense of unsafety might be helpful for you if this applies to you. And the fourth trigger, and I hear this one sometimes, only maybe once or twice would I say I've personally experienced it, and that is that it's triggered by a desire to punish yourself. Now, some people feel like their binge eating is a form of self-punishment, when actually it's the survival mechanism kicking in because they're trying to restrict, or because it's extreme hunger pushing back. So the part that wants to restrict feels like it's being punished. So that's one aspect of it, but it can show up in another way where if you were punished as a kid, right? Let's say you received quite harsh punishments. You did something quote unquote wrong, you would be punished, and then the slate kind of gets wiped clean. You've had your punishment, we can move on. That psychology, that pattern, if you like, can continue playing into adulthood. I feel bad, I feel like I've done something wrong. I need to punish myself, I need to suffer because that somehow wipes the slate clean. That's one version of it. Another version can come from a much darker place of really deep, deep self-hatred, where you just feel that you deserve to suffer. And if you relate to just even the idea or the concept that you somehow deserve to suffer, I would want to say, what is your crime? What is it about you that means you deserve to suffer? And chances are that belief or that feeling, that felt sense, goes way, way, way back. At some point when you were very young, when you didn't have the critical reasoning to think about it differently, you decided that you were bad, or you believed that you were bad, or maybe you were told that you were bad. But however it develops, whether you believed it or it was told to you, it takes root early and young, and then you carry it with you as this felt sense. I think many of us have it to some degree, but it's a scale, and if you're really high up on that self-hatred scale, it can feel like, even though to hate yourself and think that you need punishing, to me still implies like a sense of like, I deserve punishment, and that because I deserve it, that somehow balances something. So it's this attempt to resolve or balance the scales in some way. Again, if this is you, when is it that you've suffered enough? When is it that it's finally like, okay, I've finally suffered enough? Because if you're watching my videos, I imagine that you know suffering. If you've struggled with this, you know suffering. So maybe even just questioning that feeling, doubting that feeling. What if this feeling isn't true, even if it feels true, that you don't deserve that? And the fifth one, this one, if this is you, you will probably feel really frustrated sometimes with all the talk of restriction, because some of the advice given to people who restrict could be quite challenging for this category of people. And the trigger is some kind of impulse control issue. Now be cautious before you put yourself in this box, because I think many of us think, I have an issue with impulse control because I can't control my impulse to binge. So there is something around the impulse here. But I guess I'm speaking to it in terms of, for some people, like that part of their brain is genuinely compromised. Part of the brain that can stop an impulse is just not working optimally. So we could look at this in people with ADHD. And there are other impulse control, they'd call them disorders, I don't like that word. There are other impulse control disorders, but most often nowadays we're seeing ADHD. Now here's one thing that's interesting about impulse control is that it is affected by your emotional state. So stress leads to poorer impulse control in everybody. So if you already struggle with impulse control, throw some stress on the top, it's going to be even harder than perhaps a neurotypical person who might still struggle with impulse control, particularly when stressed. So stress management is a big part of it. Figuring out how to optimize your environment and this is the tricky thing where there's going to need some nuance. It's like, how do you make your environment safe enough so perhaps you don't have the impulse being triggered all the time without tipping into a scarcity restrictive mindset where it's like, I can't be around these foods because I don't have any impulse control. Because if you clear your life out of all temptations, if you like, it may mean that when you do have the opportunity to eat these foods, that your binges are even bigger. This is, I guess, such an individual thing, so it's hard to give specific advice when I'm talking to quite a broad audience. But if you're somebody who has ADHD, or you suspect you do, and it's affecting your food, there is a great video that I like by Dr. K. I will link to it again above and below, where he talks about how you can strengthen the other parts of your brain to improve your decision making and to help manage ADHD symptoms. I think it's a very hopeful video. So do you see yourself in any of these 5 triggers? Are there any other triggers that you think just don't get spoken about a lot that you feel like apply to you? If so, let me know in the comments below. And on another note, if my content is helpful to you and if you want to continue seeing it, please do subscribe and please do hit the bell icon, because the YouTube algorithms have changed a lot over the last year, I would say. And a lot of my videos are being flagged as restricted just because of the content, which means even if you subscribe to the channel, YouTube are showing my video to fewer people. So I'm seeing my view numbers drop quite a lot at the moment, but on your analytics on YouTube, it will show you how many people click on your video when they see it on their home feed. And that percentage hasn't changed. So in order for fewer people to be watching my videos, that means fewer people are actually being shown my videos, not that fewer people are choosing to watch my videos, if that makes sense. And whilst I've been very mindful about not getting too caught up in numbers, it is quite disheartening when you open your YouTube Creators app and you see all these down arrows saying like everything's going down and fewer people are watching and choosing your videos. You need to change something up. I'm like, no, YouTube, you need to change something up. You need to sort your algorithms out. I'm just here doing me. But I'm not feeling disheartened to the point where I'm thinking about not continuing to do this. I still love creating this content. I still really believe it's providing value to some people. So I'm not going anywhere yet. But this is a very long-winded way of saying, please subscribe and hit the bell icon and all of that stuff, yada, yada, yada. Thank you very much, and I will see you on the next video.